In a stunning turn of events, Oregon's voter-approved ban on so-called high-capacity magazines has been struck down as unconstitutional, a seismic win for gun rights advocates and a moment that's sending shockwaves through the legal and political landscape of the Pacific Northwest. This decision, handed down by a state court judge, is being described as nothing short of a legal earthquake, shaking the very foundations of gun control policy in Oregon and beyond. For supporters of stricter gun laws, the ruling is a major setback and a blow to gun control efforts that have been years in the making. Many activists and lawmakers had hoped Measure 114 would serve as a model for other states, but now, those hopes are in jeopardy. The law, known as Measure 114, was halted by a state court judge's permanent injunction, igniting a national debate over public safety versus Second Amendment rights. The judge's decision cited constitutional protections, arguing that the ban would infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens, and that the state had not demonstrated a clear public safety benefit that would justify such a sweeping restriction. Passed narrowly in 2022, the measure faced immediate lawsuits from gun owners and advocacy groups who argued that such magazines are standard for self-defense and recreational shooting. They claimed the law would turn thousands of responsible gun owners into criminals overnight, and that it unfairly targeted law-abiding citizens rather than addressing the root causes of gun violence. Opponents of the ban argued that restricting magazine capacity was government overreach and that it would do little to prevent crime while infringing on constitutional rights. The legal battle quickly became a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about gun control, public safety, and individual freedoms. With the Oregon Supreme Court declining to intervene, the state has now petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, turning what began as a local fight into a potential landmark case for the entire country. Legal experts say the outcome could have far-reaching implications, not just for Oregon, but for every state grappling with similar laws. The outcome could set a precedent for similar laws nationwide, making Oregon's legal battle a matter of national significance. As the case moves forward, all eyes are on the courts, and the nation waits to see how this pivotal moment will shape the future of gun rights and regulation in America. Measure 114 was a sweeping gun control initiative passed by Oregon voters in 2022, aiming to reshape firearm ownership in the state. Its most controversial element, banning the sale, manufacture, and transfer of magazines holding more than 10 rounds, though existing magazines weren't confiscated. The law also required a permit-to-purchase system, mandating a safety course, live fire training, and a tougher background check for all gun buyers. Supporters argued these steps would keep guns out of the wrong hands and reduce mass shooting casualties. The measure was seen as a moderate compromise, not a gun ban, but a regulation on dangerous accessories. Yet, its narrow victory at the polls foreshadowed the fierce legal and cultural battles that followed. Supporters of Measure 114, including anti-gun violence groups and medical professionals, claimed limiting magazine capacity would reduce mass shooting lethality and protect public safety. They argued 10 rounds are enough for self-defense, and larger magazines are unnecessary for civilians. Opponents, led by gun rights organizations, countered that these magazines are standard for many firearms and banning them infringes on the Second Amendment. They insisted the law would disadvantage law-abiding citizens in self-defense situations, while criminals would ignore the ban. Critics also argued that such restrictions punish responsible gun owners without deterring crime. The debate became a flashpoint for the broader national divide over gun rights and regulation. The legal fight reached a turning point in rural Harney County, where Judge Robert Rascio ruled Measure 114's magazine ban and permit requirements unconstitutional under Oregon's Constitution. He found that magazines over 10 rounds are commonly used for lawful self-defense, and that banning them violated Oregonians' right to bear arms. The judge dismissed the state's public safety arguments as speculative and insufficient to justify such a sweeping restriction. By grounding his decision in state law, Rascio made it harder for the state to appeal federally. Gun rights advocates celebrated the ruling as a victory for liberty, while supporters of the measure decried it as judicial overreach. The decision set the stage for a high-stakes appeal and intensified the legal battle. The Oregon case unfolded in the shadow of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2022 Bruin decision, a landmark ruling that sent shockwaves through the legal landscape surrounding gun rights and regulations across the country. The Bruin decision didn't just tweak the rules, it fundamentally changed how courts must evaluate the constitutionality of firearm laws, setting a precedent that would ripple far beyond Oregon's borders. The Supreme Court's new standard requires that any gun regulation must be deeply rooted in the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, not simply justified by modern concerns or public safety arguments. This means that lawmakers and courts can no longer rely solely on data or contemporary policy goals to defend new restrictions. Instead, under Bruin, the government must demonstrate that a proposed regulation is consistent with the types of firearm laws that existed at the time of the nation's founding, or at least during the 19th century. This history and tradition test is now the central hurdle for any state seeking to justify new gun control measures. The focus has shifted away from whether a law might make communities safer, and toward whether similar laws were actually in place in early American history. This new approach raised the bar for states defending gun restrictions. In the Oregon case, Judge Ratio cited Bruin extensively, emphasizing that the state was unable to point to any historical precedent for banning magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. The judge noted that, historically, there were no laws in early America that specifically limited the capacity of firearm magazines, making it difficult for the state to justify Measure 114 under the new standard. Challengers to the law argued that standard capacity magazines are commonly owned and used for lawful purposes, and therefore should be considered protected arms under the Second Amendment. They also pointed out that no similar bans on magazine capacity existed in the 18th or 19th centuries, reinforcing their claim that Measure 114 was out of step with the nation's historical tradition. Ultimately, the Bruin framework became the blueprint for striking down Measure 114, as the court found the law could not be justified by historical precedent. Now, this history-focused approach is shaping gun law challenges in courts across the nation, forcing states to revisit and sometimes rethink their strategies for regulating firearms. Oregon's case stands as one of the first major tests of this new legal standard, and its outcome is likely to influence how future gun laws are written, challenged, and defended throughout the United States. After Judge Ratio's ruling, Oregon's Attorney General appealed directly to the state Supreme Court, hoping to revive Measure 114. In a surprise move, the court declined to hear the case, letting the lower court's injunction stand and effectively killing the law at the state level. This left gun rights advocates celebrating and the state with few options. With state appeals exhausted, Oregon's only path was to turn to the federal courts. The focus shifted to Washington, D.C., as the state prepared to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene. The battle over Measure 114 was no longer just a state issue, it had become a national one. The implications of Oregon's case reach far beyond its borders, serving as a test case for gun laws nationwide. States like California, New Jersey, and New York have similar magazine bans now facing renewed legal challenges under the Bruin standard. Oregon's ruling offers a roadmap for challengers, arguing that standard capacity magazines are in common use and lack historical bans. A win for gun rights in Oregon could trigger a domino effect, threatening magazine restrictions across the country. For gun control advocates, the case is a warning. Failure to overturn the ruling could undermine a key tool for combating gun violence. The outcome will shape the future of the Second Amendment and gun regulation in America. With the legal battles in Oregon state courts now concluded, the fate of the state's controversial magazine ban has reached its most critical stage yet. All attention now turns to the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court, where the next chapter in this legal saga will unfold. For months, both supporters and opponents of Measure 114 have anxiously awaited this moment, knowing that the outcome could have far-reaching consequences not just for Oregon, but for the entire nation. The state of Oregon has formally petitioned the Supreme Court justices to review the case, urging them to provide much-needed clarity on how the landmark Bruin decision should be interpreted when it comes to magazine capacity limits. The legal arguments are complex, centering on whether such bans are consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, as outlined by the Supreme Court in recent years. While the Supreme Court is not obligated to take up every case, the stakes here are unusually high. Similar magazine bans are being challenged in courts across the country, and legal experts believe the justices may see Oregon's case as the ideal opportunity to finally resolve the issue on a national scale. The outcome could set a precedent that affects millions of Americans and shapes the future of gun legislation for years to come. If the Supreme Court decides not to hear the case, Measure 114's ban will be permanently struck down, marking a decisive victory for gun rights advocates in Oregon and potentially influencing similar cases elsewhere. For those who have fought against the measure, it would be a moment of celebration and vindication. On the other hand, If the court agrees to take up the case, it could become the most significant Second Amendment showdown since the Bruin decision. The justices would have the chance to clarify the limits of state power over gun ownership and set a new standard for what kinds of firearm regulations are constitutionally permissible. The stakes could not be higher. A Supreme Court ruling in favor of the ban might revive gun control efforts nationwide, giving states more authority to restrict magazine capacities. Conversely, a ruling against the ban could cement the right to own standard capacity magazines across the country, dramatically reshaping the landscape of American gun laws. As the nation watches with bated breath, Oregon's legal fight stands poised to define the future of gun laws in America. The Supreme Court's decision, whether to take the case or let the lower court ruling stand, will echo far beyond Oregon's borders, shaping the rights and responsibilities of gun owners and lawmakers for generations to come.